From 1972 to 1995, the CIA conducted extensive research on the use of extrasensory perception to gain information on unknown threats and perform espionage. The use of these psychic spies was called Operation Stargate. My guest today is Paul H. Smith. He is a retired U.S. Army major and one of the longest serving members in this military program. And he has performed thousands of remote views that has resulted in saving countless lives. Today, we aren't just going to learn something new, we're going to learn what hasn't even happened yet. Let's go.
I'm a retired Army intelligence officer with a PhD in unemployment, as my wife said, or in other words, philosophy of mind consciousness, philosophy of parapsychology. I guess my main claim to fame, such as it is I was a remote viewer in the military Stargate remote viewing program for 7 years from 1983 until 1990. But of course, I had other more conventional intelligence jobs as well, not just that. So, yeah, I don't know. That gives the background, and I suppose we can expand it from there.
And then you also are a teacher of remote viewing, right?
Mhm. Yes, I'm glad you're around to remind me of things like this. So, yeah, I have a commercial training company that teaches people remote viewing as I learned it while a military officer, from the people who developed remote viewing, uh, Ingo Swann, who we'll probably talk more about, and Dr. Harold E. Puthoff, or Hal Puthoff, as we usually call him, under the auspices of the U.S. government, contracted with SRI International, which, if people aren't aware of it, it's this huge uh, think tank that supports classified government projects. That's based in Menlo Park, California.
And that is the Stanford Research Institute, right? Is that what it stands for?
That's what it used to be
Okay.
called. They changed the name, I want to say roughly around 1972, 73, somewhere in that period, just to SRI International for, I guess they're not complicated reasons. The student body of Stanford was very upset that SRI was doing nuclear weapons research for the government, and so there was all kinds of uproar about that, and the university decided it was best to spin it off as its own entity to avoid those kind of complications.
Well, it's very, very interesting. And I think what we should definitely do is define for the people, what was this Stargate program?
Well, maybe okay, so first of all, the Stargate program, Stargate was the final code name under which a program is known. It's come to be known that as a total corporate entity. Stargate program was started really in 1972 by CIA, with the goal of evaluating the usefulness of various parapsychological phenomena for use in the intelligence world. And the main focus was remote viewing, which is I guess you could say it's a form of controlled or disciplined clairvoyance that allows a person who has learned remote viewing to perceive and describe events, persons, locations, and such that they have no way of accessing other than through the power of their own mental abilities. It doesn't involve any sensory connection, doesn't involve any technical surveillance, means it's strictly a mental, well, it is an ESP, or extrasensory perception based process.
There was a lot of success with this early on, to my understanding, with infiltrating what was going on at the time with the Cold War, correct?
Yes, what I do like to say, I'm kind of cautious. I say it didn't work all the time, which it didn't. But there were times when it absolutely did work. The evidence is there. We were able to uh, assess and describe many useful, much, well, let's see, not many, a lot of useful information about secret or hidden Soviet and other national programs that were important for the United States intelligence system to find out about. There are times when it absolutely it was, well, in fact, one of my friends says it's magic. One of the people who's in the program, a guy named Bill Ray, he says, you know what makes this work? It's just magic. Of course, he's being a little tongue in cheek there because it's obviously not magic in the classic sense of that word. But but it's really quite amazing when it functions properly and you have a success with it.
And
So
I like that you mentioned that, somebody said that it was magic because the original studies behind this that when the government was doing it, they found some scientific terms that they were hypothesizing for the reason that this would work. Do you know any of that, or can you explain why people could, kind of lower the skepticism and think that there is a way that this could work without it being so mystical?
yeah, I'm not sure which particular terms you have in mind. They did have a number of kind of hand-wavy terms, like the Russians used to call it psychoenergetics.
Right.
And in fact, our program started because the Soviet Union was spending billions, I'm sorry, not billions, millions of dollars, in fact, hundreds of millions of dollars to research this stuff that Americans would call paranormal. And of course, the CIA, its job and the military services intelligence elements as well. Their job is to evaluate anything that might be a threat. And the Soviets, of course, didn't spend that kind of money on anything they didn't hope to have some sort of result from. And so the CIA decided we needed to research this. And so that's how the program came to be. Um, and there are, of course, there have been many attempts to try and figure out what the causal mechanism is that makes this actually work. Um, the evidence is there. We have a ton of actually uh, documented evidence from a scientific perspective that does work. What we don't have is a causal story. We don't know, at least within what we call a physicalist paradigm, how it could even possibly work, and yet it does. And so there's been some speculation. Some folks think it might involve quantum non-locality, or also known as quantum entanglement. And that's probably the best candidate to explain it, at least within the physical paradigm. Um, but there's no smoking gun yet developed there. I think there's some issues with trying to explain it using quantum entanglement in terms of the kind of information that's developed, and in fact the fact that you can actually produce information that turns out to be legitimate going either backwards or forwards in time. It can, in a very rough sense, it can in fact predict the future uh, in a very in a much more refined way than that is usually meant in the tabloids or whatever.
And the fact that this is a thing that the, CIA worked on and you've been working in this for many, many years now, it it is kind of proof and shows that, we are connected some sort of way. Maybe we don't know how, but just the fact that this is possible, that is evidence that there is something connecting everything through whatever it may be, space and time.
Yeah, so that's one speculation that it involves some kind of universal connection between people in the universe, and maybe it does. But there are other ways of looking at it that might not involve this kind of cosmic connection that people often talk about. It may be that we're all individually enabled to project our consciousness, to speak very roughly here, project our consciousness, project our perceptual abilities outside of the constraints of the normal constraints of the physical universe. Doesn't involve us being connected at all. Um, and I'm sort of neutral or agnostic on this. We do not know enough to draw any conclusions, but having this kind of universal connectivity is nice and fairly elegant way of thinking about it, which may actually turn out to be true. We just don't know for a fact that it's true.
Because we kind of observe this in nature. There is such a thing as a hive ma mind in insects and in birds. So it's not out of the realm of spectrum to say that this doesn't also exist in human beings. I mean, obviously, we're
Yeah,
doing it.
it's interesting that the hive mind that's discussed. If you go to Rupert Sheldrake, who's quite a innovative researcher, he talks about morphic fields, where it isn't so much a hive mind kind of a thing. Well, let me think. Now his morphic resonance does maybe possibly involve some mental interconnection. Um, but it again, the jury is out on this, which means that's actually kind of good because then we can have these kind of discussions and explore possibilities that expand our understanding or at least expand the ground that we have to look into and to research. So, yeah. Hmm.
Can you share a little bit of the story of Pat Price and what happened?
Well, there's more than one story with Pat Price.
Well,
And more than one thing that happened. I'll kind of give you a background to him.
uh-huh.
So Pat Price was well, he was a jack of all trades. He actually was born and grew up in Salt Lake City, um, and ended up in California. And he was there one time. He was a Christmas tree salesman. Another time he did some other stuff, but he ended up as the and I probably get the position wrong, but police commissioner for Burbank, California. So he definitely became someone of stature, and he had some experience in police investigations and such. And he felt that he had developed an ability to perceive things in a non-standard way, essentially extrasensory perception. And he heard about the research program going on at SRI. I think probably when he first got connected, it was still called Stanford Research Institute. There was a open, unclassified part of the program where they just pretended they weren't connected with the government because they needed to be able to get people as research subjects, and they didn't want to give them all security clearances. So they were open about researching ESP. And he came in and volunteered, and they tried him out on some things, and he was really good. And we're talking confirmably really good. Um, there's a lot of anecdotal things about him, but they also did uh, pretty well constructed research experiments with Pat, double blind, randomized targeting, statistical analysis, all that kind of stuff. And he was very successful even with those. Probably the one that first got their attention, and this was something that Ingo Swann, who I mentioned earlier, was also involved in. Um, the CIA wanted to test every once in a while they run these little tests to make sure the program was doing what it was supposed to be doing. And so one time, their contract monitor at Langley, the CIA, just asked one of his coworkers randomly to give him uh, uh, an unidentified location. So I think they probably, now let me think, he got a set of geographic coordinates. And this is, of course, before Google Earth. It wasn't necessarily easy to see what was at a certain location.
Right.
And the folks at SRI weren't allowed to look it up on a map anyway. So uh, this gentleman's co-worker gave him just what he thought was an arbitrary set of coordinates. Well, it turned out it was the location of that CIA uh, analyst. I think it was the guy who was an analyst, his vacation cabin in West Virginia. So they gave those taskings to Swan and to Pat Price. And there was nothing about a cabin came in. They were talking about a facility that looked kind of like an old air defense site, about radar dishes or at least radio, big communications dishes and stuff. Um, and Pat went through and described all kinds of things associated with it. It turned out to be classified. What they had done is, um, apparently the two remote viewers had discovered the cabin, but had found it very boring. And just over the ridge, not very far away from the cabin, was a huge, deeply classified National Security Agency satellite downlink site that was monitoring Soviet satellite traffic and such. And and they both described it. Pat's description was remarkable, and he gave project code names and he gave the name of people working there, all kinds of stuff, and quite detailed. They never did verify the people, but several of the project code names were actually truly classified projects that NSA was working at the time. And in fact, after the CIA was given this report, NSA found out about it, and there was all kinds of outrage. They had a total security team from NSA come down and investigate the SRI program for having discovered this classified material, and it was certifiably done using remote viewing.
Was this one of the first times that all the other agencies kind of were made aware of this project and gave validity to it?
Well, at the time, of course, the CIA was aware of the program. The Air Force, part of the Air Force, was aware of the program. Um, the Navy actually had a small contract with SRI to research some things. So I wouldn't say that it's the first time that anybody besides the CIA knew about it. There was a few other folks who were witty. Uh, and I don't know to what extent NSA was aware of it, at least, so when you say, well, NSA was aware of it or CIA was aware of it, you have to understand the entire agency wasn't aware of it. There was a small, a couple of offices within each of the agencies were aware of it, but the vast majority of people working at NSA or CIA knew nothing about it and never did know anything about it until it became well published, of course, in recent times. So I am not unsure exactly who knew what at NSA about it, but they certainly didn't expect this kind of information to be brought out by someone who wasn't actually given access to the this particular facility that Pat Price and Ingo Swann remote viewed.
And this was just one of many kind of fantastic things that happened in this, Pat Price kind of legend. Because
Yes.
eventually he is found dead, or people think that he was murdered because of things that he saw,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, there's a bunch of conspiracy theories, and they're almost certainly not true. I'll tell you about that in a second. So Pat was actually ultimately he did so well that the CIA hired him directly to work for them. So they took him away from SRI as a source and engaged him full time as a remote viewer for the CIA. And about a year or so after that happened, Pat was in Las Vegas and he died. Um, and the evidence was that it was a heart attack. Okay, so here's the issue though. There's some strange things associated with this. First of all, um, everybody knew Pat had a bad heart. He was a walking time bomb as far as his condition of his heart. And so the fact that he might die of a heart attack is not a surprise by any stretch of the imagination. But the weird thing that happened was his body disappeared for 24 hours. An ambulance came and picked him up, picked the body up from the hotel, and drove off. And the body never showed up at the morgue, never showed up at hospital, nowhere. And then 24 hours later, mysteriously, it did show up in the at the morgue, in Clark County, Nevada morgue. Um, so what happened? And nobody to this day knows what happened. There's a lot of rumors out there. Oh, the CIA had him killed. That's stupid. Why would the CIA kill him if he was working for them already? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. The only reason people say that is because they suspect the CIA is the cause of all the strange mysteries and going ons out there, and it's not. Yeah, there are things the CIA does that are stupid or devious or sleazy even, but it doesn't do everything that's blamed on it. And it certainly didn't kill Pat Price. Pat actually thought the KGB was out to get him, and that makes way more sense because really the only way to get rid of a remote viewer, the only way to stop a remote viewer from remote viewing your secrets is to take them out. And he had told his daughter, and I've heard this from her personally, he told his daughter that if anything happened to him, it was almost certainly the CIA because they were out to get him. And of course, they're famous. Their MO, their technique was often to uh, poison somebody with a poison that mimics a heart attack, so that it makes it look like natural causes. There's at least one case in the United States where the CIA assassinated someone with this chemical that makes it look like you have a heart attack, and they've done it elsewhere as well. I think if he was murdered by anybody, it was the KGB, and it's possible they killed him and then arranged to haul off the body until the chemical dissipated in his body or whatever, and then brought him back. Now, that's speculation. Is that really what happened? We don't know. I mean, it's possible, given his physical condition, that he really did die of a heart attack. That still doesn't explain what happened to his body for that 24-hour period.
Right. So we can just, speculate here, and it is conspiracy, but I think the whole thing, the whole Pat Price story does add as much legitimacy as there can be, on the remote viewing as a real legitimate thing, um, because of all that, that happened in that.
Yes,
It's
well,
very
never
dramatic.
put it past a committed skeptic to come up with some excuse why even the best evidence isn't evidence.
Right. Well, conspiracy theorists will put out any reason to say that this has to do with CIA and
Yeah,
aliens. So
yeah,
that's that's something else. But so here I want to go back to this. So, we learned about so Pat Price was like a natural at this, right? They said
yeah.
he was gifted. He was a Burbank police officer. He was one of these cops that had a hunch and was solving crimes. Got linked up with Ingo Swann, who is the one that created a technique to teach people how to do this, the technique that you
Well,
teach now, right?
yeah, let me clarify a couple points here. So first off, Pat Price, um, there's no indication that he knew Ingo Swann before Price showed up to SRI. He may have uh, met Hal Puthoff before that. The one thing to say here, and I hate to bring this up because I know it'll cause all kinds of speculations, but Pat was a Scientologist, and he'd obviously been born a Mormon, but had ultimately become a Scientologist, and Puthoff at the time was a Scientologist, as was Ingo Swann. And Scientology has some mind training techniques in it, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not that had anything to do with remote viewing. But nonetheless, it's possible that through some Scientology connection, that Price ended up in the SRI program. Um,
Okay.
so, I don't know. I don't know what, if anything, what role Scientology plays with it, but it's becoming more widely known that that was an element, at least in some way. There's some connection there. So anyway, Price ends up there, and that appears to be where he first met Ingo Swann. And it wasn't like they were fast friends or hung out together very much. They knew of each other and they worked some of the same projects and stuff. Um, but
Okay,
yeah.
but as far as developing the technique to learn this, that was all Ingo Swann, right?
So Ingo Swann actually, yeah, thank you for reminding me of the other half of the thing I wanted to say. Ingo Swann was actually, we call him the father of remote viewing. He's the one that invented, created, discovered, I don't know what word you want to use, but developed the idea of remote viewing in the first place, and he gave it its name. This happened back in 1971. He was doing research with the American Society of Psychical Research under a guy named Carlos Osis. They were doing out-of-body experiments, and Swan was dissatisfied with the protocol they were using. He felt like it was unscientific. He felt like it was complicated and wasn't the best way of doing things. And he came up with this new experimental protocol that he named remote viewing, which is simplified but also more easily sealed against inadvertent. It essentially made uh, uh, able to be double blinded and all that kind of thing. Not to say that the Osis's experiments weren't, but this was Ingo felt a better and more scientific approach to it. And then there was a period when he was working with these folks in the civilian world, and then Puthoff became aware of him through an interesting little chain of events, which maybe we'll get to in a minute. But he was invited out to SRI with Puthoff just to do one trial experiment to see what he could do. And it was very successful. And Puthoff sent a little informal paper around, and it ended up on the weird desk of the CIA. We call it the weird desk, but it's where they looked into things that were unusual, generally off the radar scope of most other uh, intelligence collectors and stuff. And they were the ones who were responsible for monitoring the Soviet paranormal program. Anyway, it ended up there, and so those folks came to Puthoff and said, "We'd like to start a little program here." And the reason, of course, was SRI was a classified secure facility, and so they could do research there without the rest of the world coming to know about it. And so Swan then ended up in that mix as one of the consultants to the SRI program and worked with them for, wow, 15 years, I guess, maybe a little more than that. Um, so yeah.
And he was also, as you guys would describe, a natural at this, right? Both Pat Price and Ingo Swann had a natural ability to
Yeah, they
remote view.
did have natural ability. Of course, that's maybe not saying much because the research at SRI showed that everybody's got a natural ability. Essentially, anybody who wants to put in the time and learn the principles of it properly, it's possible to learn them improperly, and then you don't have a lot of success. But to learn the principles properly and put in the time to master it, anybody can be a remote viewer for
And this was
pretty
what
much.
brings me now to your story,
Hmm.
because we have a guy like a Pat Price and Ingo Swann, which they showed natural ability at this, and now you come in. How did you get linked up? And as far as I know, and you can correct me on this, you did not
Yeah.
have any natural ability at this, but you guys
Uh,
did share some common traits.
yes, I knew of no ability. So I'll back up a little bit and start. My story was probably the best place to start was junior high, roughly. I'd always been interested in science fiction, and I really loved science fiction. Then that involved some kind of ESP element, like Andre Norton, who had telepathic cats and stuff in her stories, and Zena Henderson, who had talked about aliens that look just like us, but who had ESP abilities, and so on. I found that literature very interesting. Then in junior high, I was part of a science fair project that involved the Zener cards or the ESP cards, which are the wavy lines. You see this in the opening shot of Ghostbuster, right? Wavy
Right.
lines, the square, the circle, whatever. You try and guess which card the person is thinking about or whatever. That totally failed. I was, according to that, psychic as a brick. Nobody in that entire science fair project had any success at all. And so I became a bit of a mild skeptic. So fast forward a few years, and I'm in the Army. I'm a captain stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, and working Mideast desk. I was a Mideast analyst at the time, and in fact, compiling a exhaustive name list of Iranian government and military officials. That was my job. So
Sounds exciting.
anyway, it was tedious. I mean, it was really tedious. And then one day I get a knock on my door, and it's the guy who shared a wall with me and we were in these townhouses, and he was on the other side of the wall, his family, named Skip Atwater, and across the street was Tom McNair, and they come up to my door and they knock on my door, and I say, "Oh, come on in," and they come in and they say, "We think you might be good at what we do." And I said, "What do you do?" And they said, "We can't tell you." I said, How do I know that? I would be good or not. They said, we're going to give you these tests. And they gave me some psychology and personality profile tests. Some of them are pretty conventional. The MMPI, Myers-Briggs, a few others like that, and some special testing instruments and such. Anyway, they said, if you score where we think you're going to, we will read you on and then give you the opportunity to volunteer. And so I filled out the test, gave them back to them. A few days later, they said, okay, you look like you're a candidate. Come on over such and such a time. So I go over to the offices, and Tom sits me down in the back room and gives me this read-on statement. So essentially a non-disclosure in civilian terms, non-disclosure agreement. Really strict. I call it my Men in Black moment because it was like when Tommy Lee Jones is reading on Will Smith in the Men in Black program, where you have to sever all human connections, you have to have your fingerprints erased, blah 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 blah. Right? It wasn't quite that bad, but it was. I was read on at the time up through top secret, special compartmented intelligence, numerous caveats, including some nuclear weapons material as well. So I mean, you don't get much higher than that. You can, but not much higher. And yet, this was worse than anything I'd ever had to sign before in terms of being strict. I eventually found out it had to be strict because it was aimed not just at protecting the secrecy of the program, it was aimed at protecting, literally protecting the lives of the remote viewers. Because again, the only way to stop a remote viewer from remote viewing you is to take them out.
Wow.
Nobody wanted that to happen, obviously. So anyway, I signed this thing, and then Tom says, well, our mission here is to collect intelligence against a foreign threat using a parapsychology discipline called remote viewing. Uh, we're essentially inviting you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. I don't know if he actually said psychic spy, but it was words to that effect. Now, you don't have to tell me right now. You have 24 hours to make up your mind. And what he didn't know was I had been excited about ESP forever and now then had become a skeptic. And now, as he's telling me this, my brain is saying, whoa, this means the government actually has a program to teach people how to do this stuff, which means it must actually work. There's no way I'm not going to do this. So as soon as he quit talking, I said, oh, I'm in. I absolutely want to do this. And he was a bit surprised, I think, because usually people have to, I don't know, I better think about it. I don't know what effect it have on my career. At that point, I didn't care what effect it had on my career. I wanted to do that more than anything. So it was
Yeah.
like from 0 to 60 in a split second.
And it sounds like every kid's dream. And then from there, I mean, so let's go back. What year was this?
That was 1983, as I recall, August of 1983.
Okay, so that's in 1983. So the program's been out for maybe 15 years now, right? Something like that.
Well, it'd
So
be 11. The
okay.
CIA gave them their first money towards the end of 1972. So it was about 11 years at that point.
And now, do you have any feelings that maybe they just asked everybody and took as many people as they could and see who would work at this? Or do you think it was something that you filled out specifically during those tests that you were taking that they saw something in?
No, they didn't go for everybody. In fact, when they first stood up the Army program, which had happened, let's see, 79, about 4 or 5 years before this, um, they they did a survey of intelligence professionals in the DC area and considered I can't tell the exact big numbers to begin with, but it was like 1,600 people or something like that. They sent out a survey, which was a standard survey. There were just 2 or 3 questions about paranormal topics on it that could have been a screening mechanism to weed out wackos, right? That's how it could be viewed by someone taking it. And then the people who answered those questions positively, then they went and interviewed them again in a fairly non-committal sort of a way to see why they might have answered those questions that way and so on. And then they narrowed that down to 36 people. And no, let me think, that was the 36 people. Then they narrowed that down to 12 people and actually told them about the intent of the program.
Do you
And
remember
of
any?
those, they selected 6 to be
Oh
trained.
wow. Oh wow.
Yeah.
That is so really they really drilled it down. So do you remember any of the questions that they might have asked that would now tip you off to say, okay, that was the question that kind of started to narrow down the pipeline of who would be good at this?
Yeah, I couldn't, I know, I mean, that's been 40, 50 years, something like that. How long ago was 83? 40 years ago?
Yeah, about 40 years ago,
Yeah, 40
40,
years ago.
30
Yeah,
years
no,
ago.
I don't remember specific questions, but they were like one of the tests, actually, one of the more specialized testing instruments they used was the INSCOM factors questionnaire. I do remember the name of the test. And it like had the spectrum, and it might say things are operating in the world that go beyond our physical senses. And then you say 0 from I don't believe that at all the way up to 10, absolutely true, right? And I'm making that question up. I don't know if that was really one, but there might be something like that on there, right? And so another question might be people can know things without having any sensory connection or knowledge. So like an ESP kind of a question, 0 to 10. And if you scored high enough on that series of questions, that's when they would be then willing to read you on and, take that risk of adding somebody else into the category of people who know about it.
Very interesting because, one thing that I did notice in the research was it seems to be one of the key ingredients for someone to be good at this is creativity. So now Inga Swan was an artist, and you have some sort of artistic background yourself. Is that true?
Yeah, so some of the criteria they were looking for is, first of all, they were looking for military intelligence officers at the time, essentially Army intelligence officers. And of course, the first criteria were logical, like you had to have good report cards, you had to be in a proper place in your career development, you had to be well thought of and well respected in the job you were doing, and those kind of things. But then they added a few more things, like uh, um, they were looking for people who were involved in some kind of creative pursuit, what we might call right brain activity. So, like studio art or maybe music performance or something along those lines. Well, I kind of tipped the scale on that one because I had majored in art when I was going to school at BYU and illustrated some textbooks and such. I love to do landscape watercolor and things like that. I had been playing guitar for about 20 years by then. Another thing was if you were if fairly proficient in foreign languages, because that also involves a different part of your brain than your typical language, native language does. And so I was fluent in German and had been trained in Arabic and Hebrew. Um, I like to write short stories, short fiction, and send them off and have them rejected. So, and yeah, and there are a few other things besides I don't remember right now. So I had a really strong creative component there. And of course, that's not common for military officers of any kind. It's not out of the question, but it still isn't common. So that was an indicator of success in the remote viewing world. If you had a creative background of some kind, you had some creative abilities, that tended to indicate you're going to be more successful as a remote viewer than someone who didn't have that side to them.
And it's very interesting that you say that too, because in, discussions with artists, they'll often say that their creativity comes from an unexplainable source. Is almost their, it's being directed to them from the universe.
It's
Does that
called,
make sense?
yeah, and from
Inspiration.
the old Greek world called having a muse, and of course that's been adopted even in our modern world. A muse is a source of inspiration that you can't really put your finger on where it comes from. And
Very similar to this remote viewing, which we don't know where
yeah,
it's coming from, but you're tapping into something there. So people with a more creative side maybe are open to accessing this more. Do you find so far as in your teaching that people that are creative are more successful at it?
um, I think what they do is they learn it a little quicker. Oftentimes it allows them to be more accurate in presenting data because they're used to expressing inner processes in more than just verbal terms. And so let's go back to the thing about the muse and the intuitive element in creation. One of the reasons that it's like that is because creative activities uh, are much more focused in the right brain. Now, there are going to be psychologists out there listening to this who are going to cringe when I talk right brain, left brain, and I recognize that there's a lot of hand wavy stuff that goes on that people talk about it. And I'm using it as a shortcut here to describe what's really is really kind of true of the way human mental processing works. While it is true that the right brain and left brain interact much more than a lot of the new agey folks understand, there are localized functions in each hemisphere that tend to skew one way or the other. So there are some things that tend to be mediated much more by the right brain, and other processes that are tend to be mediated much more by the left brain. So I still talk in those terms. The fact is, the right brain is alingual, essentially. And again, this is speaking very roughly, but generally speaking, language and such is most at home in the left brain. And in the right brain, it doesn't really talk about itself much, to speak very, very loosely. And so oftentimes you'll have things happening that originate in the right brain, and the left brain really doesn't know where that came from, right? Exactly. So, um, and that oftentimes what we call intuition, oftentimes what we call inspiration or whatever, is it involves right brain processes that develop thoughts, ideas, patterns, and such that then become accessible to the left brain. And the left brain doesn't know where it came from, but finds them useful. Okay, and so oftentimes the creative process probably isn't anything magical. I mean, the Greeks thought the muse was something outside the person, um, but oftentimes a creative consequence, you come up with something creative or innovative, probably isn't something that's magically happening. It probably is something that the right pattern recognizing part of the brain figured out and passed it on. Now, that's a whole long preamble to say remote viewing, the whole process seems to be very rooted in the right hemisphere. Um, a lot of research they did at SRI, and they had considerable input from scientists who were into brain specialization, some of the early researchers in that, and even subsequent ones as well. And so they had a general idea about that. And the things that happen in remote viewing indicate are strongly indicative of right brain processing. Now, we know that um, much of what you get from remote viewing, even though it seems to be passed through the right brain, at least processed by the right brain, doesn't originate in the right brain either. It's got to be coming from somewhere. We use the term non-locally, outside of our skulls, essentially. Because when you think about it, if you're describing a target on the other side of the planet and you can accurately sketch and verbally describe this thing, give facts about it that you have no inkling about, you have no way of knowing, and yet you are correct about those things, and you don't have any sensory connection, you don't have any technical connection with that target, and you are working in a fully blind way, that's a very strong indicator this information is coming from outside of you. Okay. But it first engages with your local consciousness, if you will, in the right brain region. At least that's what the evidence seems to indicate in the sorts of things that come in. And then the left brain gets involved in the process as well at
And
that point.
and the left brain's usually the one that screws it up, is the one where when you have that good idea and then you don't take it, or you have that gut instinct and you don't follow your instincts and
Yes,
you
that's
overthink
true.
things.
And the left brain also tends to throw stuff in that isn't true, right? So there's this old joke that God made chocolate in heaven and the devil threw the calories in when it landed, right? It was kind of like that. In remote viewing, you get non-local data through your right brain. The left brain gets that information and then starts speculating, trying to figure out what it means. and in the process often gets it wrong. We call that analytical overlay because the left brain is analyzing this information and it doesn't have a total complete picture. And so it starts to jump to conclusions and it ends up giving you the wrong answer, even though the original data might have been correct.
And that's how I stumbled onto this, you know, trying to find a way to, trust my instincts, trust my intuition more. Seems like this is a path, and kind of your process to get people to learn this is proven. And I'd like to ask you now about if you can explain your first experience at remote viewing and how you knew that, okay, I can do this.
Well, that's actually kind of a funny story. So, and this was in September of 83. I had just signed into the program on the 1st of September. This was maybe that week or the week after. I could look it up. I don't remember exactly, but we were doing Skip Atwater, he was both the training and the operations officer for the Army program. And he liked to get people's feet wet right off the bat. But we had not yet learned the methodology we were being hired, so to speak, to learn, which was CRV or controlled remote viewing. That was our training there wasn't going to start until January, but he still wanted us to get some experience. So we did what's called an outbounder. And an outbounder session or an outbounder experiment, you have a team of people, usually two, you don't want to have too many, that go to a randomly selected location. And you, the viewer, are in a closed room, so you have no inkling of where they went. And you have a monitor or an interviewer who's there to help you with the process, but they also have to be fully blind to the target. So you're the blind leading the blind here. Neither one of you know what the target is. And anyway, Skip was my monitor, and the target was selected, somewhere else. And two folks went to the target, and the target was, well, I won't tell you what that is for a second. And so I'm in the room, and Skip says, "Okay, Tom and Charlene have gone to a location. Neither one of us know where it is. I want you to describe what is there." And think about these people, you aren't reading their minds. That confusion comes in. People think, well, it's one person and another person, you must be reading their mind who's at the target. That's not the case. These people are just there as markers. We call them beacons. So what your job as a viewer is to go out into the universe and find these two people and then survey the setting in which they are and describe what you perceive there. Okay. So I start talking about, well, there's this room and it's off-white walls, kind of a pebbly texture on the walls, and there's windows with little lacy curtains, and there's little round tables, and at one end there's this flat transparent thing and you can see stuff behind the flat transparent thing and so on and so on. I'm describing this room. It's kind of milky light coming through the windows and so on.
If I can ask you right there, so how did you know how to start thinking of them? What did they tell you to how to access them at whatever
All
point they
Skip
were?
said was, Tom and Charlene are at a place. I want you to find Tom and Charlene, open your mind, and tell me what you perceive.
And you were not under any sort of hypnosis, hypnotic trance. You were just sitting in a room, and he said, "Do
Well,
this."
so I left this part out because it's yet more complications. So what I had been done what's called hemisync tape. So these audio tape, brain entrainment frequency that supposedly gets your two hemispheres synchronized to each other, and you get in kind of a altered state, I guess, a mild altered state of consciousness, kind of like being. Well, I guess no. I'm leaving this part out too. So essentially, you're establishing what's called a hypnagogic state. It's mind awake, body asleep, and the hemisync tape was designed to. You're wearing headphones, obviously, designed to induce you into this mind awake, body asleep, hypnagogic state. Okay, so yeah, I was in in that. And I was laying on a bed. I wasn't, in fact, I like to joke we were the only operational military intelligence unit that had a bed as part of our tactical equipment. Right? So, so anyway, so I'm on the bed and Skip is interviewing me, right? And so I'm in this kind of altered state, and I just kind of cast my mind to Tom and Charlene, and I start describing this room. Okay. And then the time comes to end, and Tom and Charlene return back, and part of the protocol is the outbound team comes back, gets the viewer, takes them to the site, okay, and then the viewer gets feedback that way. So they come in, they bring us some donuts and stuff, and we're eating the donuts, and we're driving back, and we go to the site, which is this massive blue water tower with a central pillar, and then ringed around the outside are these big, probably 3 foot diameter pipes that go up to the mushroom shaped top of it. I won't say brilliant blue, but a very noticeable, striking blue. Nothing I got in the session, nothing I got matched that target. And I'm going, oh no, they're going to fire me before I ever even start.
Right.
So I'm really pretty dejected. And we're driving down the road back to Fort Meade, and we go by this building, and my attention is drawn to the building. And I said, what's that over there? And Skip turns to me because he had figured out what had happened. He said, first thing he said, and this is a lesson learned, if you don't get the target, it doesn't matter what else you get instead. And I go, okay, I don't, what? He said, okay, let's go there. So we went over a park, walk in the door, little tables, lacy curtains, filtered milky light, off-white walls with this kind of pebbly texture to it. In one end, there was this thing with glass in it. You could see little things behind it. Donuts. Okay, donuts. So
Wow.
Tom and Charlene had stopped at that place on the way back and bought donuts. And I had picked up on the donut place and not the tower. And it was very obvious to me that I had indeed remote viewed that donut place because it totally matched my perceptions.
That's so, I mean, that must have been like it's such an aha moment for you that, wow, I
Oh,
can
it,
actually do this.
oh, it was, but Skip wasn't giving me any points for it. And they had violated the procedure. The procedure is you go straight to the target, you come straight back from the target, you don't diverge, you don't do anything else. And maybe I would have got the water tower if that had been what they did. But they stopped the donut shop. And later, well, I told him this story 20 some odd years later. I guess my father-in-law said, yeah, trust you to find the donut place.
Uh, so I think that's pretty interesting because now you're sharing how they told you specifically go to the target, come back, because now we know in years prior there was issues with, say, a Pat Price that found some things he wasn't supposed to, and they don't want that to happen again. Seems like they were trying to
Yeah,
prevent
I
it.
mean, I couldn't tell you when, but they had played with this procedure. So Ingo actually introduced a very early form of it before SRI even got involved. Again, in 1971 at the ASPR in New York, um, he'd introduced a form of outbounder. Um, he really innovated a lot of things. And they had been playing with it at SRI for okay, so for by that time, 83 for 11 years, 11, 12 years probably at some point. And so they'd had a lot of lessons learned on how to do it. But but at Fort Meade, apparently Tom and Charlene hadn't given it a thought, or they hadn't been well briefed on the process. I don't know. And so they had just done that one detour, and it messed my session up. Although in a way, it was actually probably even more persuasive than if I had gone to the actual target, because I'd been wrong, and yet here I had actually absolutely convincingly described another a sub-target of what it was. And it was, at least to me, it was very persuasive that I had really successfully done this.
Yeah, and it definitely is to me too. And can you describe that first feeling? Like, how did you know the donuts? You didn't see a picture of the donuts. Did you feel something that was like a donut, or
No,
how
no,
did
I
you?
didn't know it was donuts. I had no
Huh,
idea it was donuts. What I just got was these impressions of a, and the only thing that had to do with donuts is this transparent thing, and behind it some other things arranged. And I didn't know what those other things were. I just had perceived them. It's like I was standing in the middle of the room and I was looking around myself and I noticed this, what turned out to be the counter up at the far end. Okay. Now, when I say looking around, and people have this vision of if they were physically standing there and looking around, how vivid and clear it was. Remote viewing isn't like video in the head. It's not really sharp and clear under most circumstances. It's a vague perception. I talk about it in terms of being like a, it's like a half remembered memory, a memory you have from 10 years ago. It comes into mind. You know how it's got kind of a fuzzy edge around it. You recognize the memory, and you recognize the details in it, but it's not clear at all.
right.
That's really a lot like what the remote viewing experience is like. It's not clear, and sometimes you don't even get a visual experience at all. In fact, quite often you don't, but you sort of know. And it's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. It's like, how do you tell somebody what it's like to ride a bike if they've never done it? So um, there's a kind of a knowing that often happens where, for example, let's say the target involves large swath of red, and you come in on this target and you don't see red, but you just know down in your core, there's red here. There's something that's red here. And so, you acknowledge there's red. Now, you don't know the extent of it. You don't know what it is that's got the red on it. You don't know any of that stuff, at least at that point. But you do know, and if there wasn't red there, you'd be really surprised because it feels so strong that you've got red there. But that can happen with all kinds of things in a remote viewing setting, including complex abstract things like purposes and intentions and uh, and so on. So um, there's the visual experience, but it isn't all about visual. In fact, it probably should not even have been named remote viewing. I'd much prefer the term remote perception because that's really more what it's about. But Ingo really interacted visually with a lot of his targets, and so he wanted to call it remote viewing
Hmm.
when he named it.
Wow. If you had to pick one where you said, okay, this was a remote viewing experience that I had that, kind of seems, otherworldly, people wouldn't really comprehend what I just experienced. What would one of those be?
So are you talking about some kind of anomaly target, or you're just talking about a target that really blew my mind?
Something that blew your mind that you go, whoa, I can't
Okay.
believe that I just witnessed
Well,
or
my
felt that.
go-to one, my go-to one actually was remote viewing an event that didn't happen for 50 hours after I had remote viewed it. So I'll set the stage here. So I was asked to go over to the operations building and do a remote viewing session, and the my tasker monitor had an idea of what he thought I was going to find, but it turned out a kind of a fishing expedition. The tasking was describe the most important event that we need to know about in the next few days. Now, I don't know the exact wording, but that's what it amounted to is remote view the most important event for us to know about it in the next few days. And so I don't know that's what the tasking is. One of the rules is you can't know what your tasking is as a viewer. You have to be blind to that. And so I just got a number, I don't know, 8675309. That's my throwaway number, right? I just got a number and I sat down and started remote viewing, and I'll make this very condensed. So I get the perception of a vessel, and it seemed to be a warship. In fact, it even seemed to be a U.S. destroyer of some sort, sailing in a closed body of water. In other words, there's land on three sides, and it was at night, and it was sailing along. And off in the distance, I had a perception of an aircraft that was kind of loitering around. Some point, the aircraft dropped one or two long cylindrical objects with little stubby wings that made a roaring, guttering sound. And they flew around, and then ultimately they engaged the ship. that I had seen before. And there's smoke and flames, and the ship leans to one side, lists to one side, and the aircraft, is being controlled by a kind of a third world military in a third world country many miles inland. Um, anyway, so it went on, and there was much more detail. One of my AOLs, one of my analytical overlays was, um, so this was in 1987, and in 1980, I want to say 80 or 81 was the Battle of the Falklands, where the Argentinians launched some Exocet missiles at a British warship and essentially sank it. That was this AOL I had. It was like an aircraft had fired Exocet missiles at this maybe an American warship in this closed body of water at night. And my colleague, who had expected me to report on something else, said, "Oh," after I'd gone spent an hour or more at this and given much more detail than I've told you now. So, "Oh, you're off. I guess we'll end there." And he says, "Don't worry, people, we're off all the time here, and not every session is a success. So let's just go home for the weekend." It was a Friday. So I put this in my safe drawer and we went home. Monday morning, I get a call from Skip Atwater. He says, "Paul, where's that session you did on Friday?" And I said, "Well, it's in my safe drawer. Why do you care? I was off." And he said, "You haven't seen the papers this morning, have you?" And so I get my copy of the Washington Post and I open it up, and right there above the fold, U.S. warship hit by Exocet missiles fired by an Iraqi jet.
Wow. Oh my God.
I'm reading this story, and everything that was in my session was in that story, and nothing in that story that wasn't in my session. Obviously, to different levels of detail, but it was like I had read that. I was doing a summary of that newspaper report last Friday, 50 hours before this event happened. Um, and Skeptics have since tried to explain this away, saying, "Well, there was a tanker war going on where the Iranians were shooting at tankers carrying oil to and from Iraq. U.S. warships were in the Gulf. You probably just had that in your head, and it all came out in this session." Well, there's a lot of reasons to explain why that couldn't possibly be true. But one of the interesting things was in the session, I had this perception of a multi-engine aircraft that was flying off, observing at a distance. And nothing in the newspaper reports, nothing in what I'd learned around the time had indicated the presence of such an aircraft. About a year later, I got a copy of the Navy's official after action report explaining how this event had unfolded. And after a great deal of investigation, it was in a class I was taking at the National Intelligence University on indications and warning in the intelligence realm, and this was one of their textbooks. And I'm reading this thing through, and I'm checking off the blocks of all the stuff I'd said in my session. And then I come to this point where it said there was a Saudi AWACS, it's a big multi-engine aircraft, Saudi AWACS off in the distance, observing this whole thing unfold and desperately trying to get Saudi F-15s in to intercept the Iraqi plane. And so even that one thing I had thought might be wrong in my session turned out to be right.
Wow.
A year after this had all been put to bed. So the skeptics attempt to rationalize this away. Uh, their okay, what is it? Their own being victimized by their own confirmation bias, right?
Right.
Um, um, it was really hard to support based on everything that was associated with that session.
That is an incredible story. Oh my God. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining today. People that want to learn from you directly, buy your books, where should we direct them?
Well, probably the best place is my website, rviewer.com. So that's the letter R and the word of viewer, rviewer.com. You can go there and pretty much everything is anything you might want to know about this. I have an explanation of my training. I have a lot of background information on remote viewing that's just free for the reading there. I have a blog in which I talk about a lot of different aspects of this that you can access. Just an alert, I had to reconfigure this website about a year ago, and it's a big website, and so there are still some links that may not go all the way through, but and various things like. But by and large, you can access a lot of really useful things there. So, yeah, rviewer.com.
Fantastic. I'll make sure we put that there in the show notes
And
too. But
let me put
yeah,
out a pitch for my
yeah,
book,
yeah.
The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. Again, Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. It's available on Amazon. I wrote this book specifically for people who might be unfamiliar with remote viewing and want just a general, no nonsense, no woo woo, kind of a overview of what it is, science behind it, possible explanations, how it's being used, that kind of thing. And there's even a couple of chapters that tell you how to do it at a very basic level. It's also good for people who are in remote viewing and have friends or relatives that might be a little dubious about what this is that they've gotten themselves involved in and want to give someone a good introduction that isn't going to talk about weird things, bottomless snowmen, yetis, whatever, you know. So,
This is the stuff that kind of gets people a little more interested in my opinion.
well, it depends on the people, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, if you have somebody that's skeptical of your involvement in remote viewing, you don't want to give it to somebody, give a book to somebody that focuses on remote viewing aliens from Zeti Reticuli,
Okay.
right? You want a down-to-earth, science-based approach, and they can get into the weird stuff later on if they want, but to start off with, you don't want to give them the weird stuff to begin with because so much of that, there's so much baloney out there about remote viewing and that kind of thing. So that associated with this.